I'm Rachel Bovard.
I'm Emily Jashinsky.
I'm Ben Weingarten.
And I'm Josh Hammer.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. So welcome back, everybody. We have a bunch of topics to discuss today. Outside of our normal realm, I think we're going to touch on some new stuff, which I think is interesting. I'm going to first talk about everybody's favorite topic, what's going on in the United States Senate. I promise to make it somewhat interesting. Emily's going to talk about a speech recently given by Senator Rubio on what pro-American capitalism might look like. Josh is going to talk about the victims of blue cities fleeing outside city limits. And then Ben's going to wrap us up with talking about how America's investors are foaming at the mouth to get into China. But with that, I guess I will kick it off. So we're in December right now, and that is usually the month of horror for Congress because they've kicked a bunch of deadlines to December, and they all act completely surprised every single year that they've reached this point, despite creating all these crises for themselves. It's really a remarkable feat of acting ability. But one of them is the debt ceiling. And now the debt ceiling you may be familiar with is kind of basically what the country's borrowing limit. They have to continue to meet its obligations, that then the debt ceiling needs to be raised, roughly every year. And we're now hovering around a $2 trillion increase. Now, Senate Republicans, helped Democrats raise this debt ceiling. And then Mitch McConnell very famously sent a letter to Biden and Schumer and said, look, we're not going to do this. We're not going to help you anymore. And what's fascinating now is the fact that we know that wasn't true, right? Both Republicans and Democrats want this debt ceiling to be raised, despite all the machinations and the flailing and the rhetoric that, establishment Republicans are going on about. They want this done. And what they've created now in the Senate is this manic contortion to make it look like they are not helping Democrats raise the debt ceiling. Well, they in fact are. And then to boot, they are sort of striking at a very foundational part of the filibuster in a year where Democrats are trying to not only eliminate the legislative filibuster, but create these carve-outs around it. So let me sort of explain how this works. So what they've teed up is a bill to, it's about Medicare, right? It's a bill to sort of shut off cuts that are coming to Medicare. And in that bill, it is a procedure that will be created upon its passage to tee up a special one-time privileged resolution to raise the debt ceiling at 51 votes. And this privileged mechanism will, magically expire after it's used. So Senate Democrats are basically going to, provide the 60 votes necessary to get on this bill and pass it, and then tee up this process by which Democrats will pass the debt ceiling by themselves. But the sort of hypocrisy here should be clear because it's not the resolution that passes the debt ceiling, right? That actually passes the debt ceiling. It's everybody voting for cloture on the first bill. It's the first bill setting up passage of the debt ceiling that's actually passing the debt ceiling. So Republicans are in fact helping Democrats. But even worse, in my opinion, is the fact that we've spent the last year listening to Democrats say, we need to upend the legislative filibuster. If we can't get that, then what we should have is these special carve-outs, these 51 vote carve-outs for things like voting legislation, or climate change or whatever. And here you literally have Mitch McConnell agreeing to the premise that you can create special filibuster carve-outs for things like the debt ceiling. And you just have to imagine how this is going to be used. You see Bill Kristol already today saying, after they approve the debt ceiling at 51 votes, they should move on to this election meddling bill at 51 votes. This is now going to be the hue and cry that we see from Democrats moving forward. And the Republicans have lost all moral authority to say, no, we can't do that, because they're clearly willing to do it for, uniparty priorities. And so anything deemed worthy now is going to be, shoved into this framework of, well, you did it for debt ceiling, you can do it for everything else. This is a slow erosion of the filibuster. And I know I'm one of 12 people who care about the filibuster, but I do think it's a very important component to the Senate's role in democracy. So I'll leave it there and throw it open. You can say the filibuster is worthless if you want, but I do think that this is just the height of hypocrisy from Senate Republicans. It just drives me crazy.
Yeah, I don't really have a whole lot to add. I agree with you, Rachel, on the filibuster. I know that there are some kind of broadly speaking, kind of new right aligned friends of ours who are kind of maybe less gung ho about retaining filibuster. I mean, it seems to be like a quintessentially conservative institution. And you can kind of go back to the early days of the Republic. The House was always kind of like the heated boiler room of sorts. The Senate, of course, was the cooling saucer. It's kind of always been like the entire purpose of the institution, the world's greatest deliberative body, and all of that stuff. Has the Senate always lived up to that? I mean, obviously not, to put it mildly. But there's something to be said about kind of. I mean, the other podcast I co-host, Newsweek's The Debate Podcast, we actually did a whole episode on the filibuster a few weeks ago. And we had on Professor Charles Lipson, kind of a professor emeritus of political science at the University of Chicago, who made a lot of these kind of similar arguments. And the shrieks and cries from the other side, if I can just say that about a guest that we had on the other podcast goes, it was just entirely non-substantive. I mean, it was kind of like an AFL-CIO guy who basically just said, it's been 100 years since we haven't updated our labor laws. We need to act now. It was nothing even remotely intellectually engaging. So I've never found the other side of this argument particularly compelling here. As far as the debt ceiling mechanism itself, I have to say, I do wonder whether, and this is a slightly tangential topic to the actual filibuster, I wonder whether the debt ceiling fights as we currently do it are actually the best that we can do as far as trying to retain a modicum of fiscal sanity. I understand that it's kind of like a mechanism that forces people to take tough votes, and obviously kind of you go back to 2011, Cantor and the then kind of ascendant Tea Party kind of got Boehner to concede and sequestration, all that. But other than that, it's kind of hard to pinpoint, and tell me if I'm wrong, Rachel, you're more in the weeds than I am, but it's kind of hard to pinpoint one moment where the debt ceiling fight has truly resulted in serious wins for fiscal conservatives. So I kind of do wonder whether the specific mechanism that we have in place is actually worth it at the end of the day.
Well, we got the Budget Control Act by leveraging the debt ceiling in 2013. And that was the last major discretionary spending fight we won with Boehner and Obama. And we had to force Boehner into it. But, again, to the point, it's something that both establishment parties want. Just vote on it. Don't go through this procedural chicken to hide from us. Just tell us what you want. This is why people hate Washington.
Yeah, it knows that. And that's kind of the very final point I'll make, and then I'll kick it over to Ben and Emily, is it's just this duplicity, right? This kind of imagery of public facing, trying to say one thing while doing something else behind your back. But the people are just so sick and tired of that. I mean, if there was one thing that we could pinpoint, it's why Trump won in 2016, it was being fed up literally with that. Literally with Beltway, Washington speak of politicians of both parties, of all establishments, saying one thing to voters and then just utterly lying about it while doing the complete opposite behind their back. So I completely agree with you on that, of course.
I think Rachel is right to read into this the slow erosion of the filibuster. And I actually, because the left has been increasingly adamant about repealing the filibuster, I don't think they have reckoned with what the consequences of that would look like. We're having fights about the debt ceiling now. I guess it's still, maybe we'll pine for the days where we actually fought about the debt ceiling. Maybe we'll pine for the days where there was a modicum of resistance. And that's kind of the big picture out of the sort of granular stuff that Rachel understands 20 times better than I ever could, because she put herself through the misery of working in the Senate for so long. But the big picture here is we're fighting about this. This is not good. It's not good that we have to do this every single year, that this is something that keeps repeating itself is deeply, deeply unhealthy. It's so unhealthy. And that you're now wrapping in to this, the slow erosion of the filibuster is so alarming, and it sort of flies under the radar sometimes because it'll be big news in Playbook and in DC circles, and it takes up a lot of people's time in Congress. But this is a symptom of a very, very deeply unhealthy country, and I'm reminded of that every single time we have this fight.
Yeah, I mean, I always kind of, in my mind, harken back to Ace of Spades. That blog wrote this post, I don't know how many years back now, about failure theater. And it just so perfectly defines kind of the Republican response. Try to act as if you're putting up a real defense here. Of course, they're perpetually on defense. And then in reality, of course, it's always accede to the other side's demands. And it's worth pointing out, by the way, I know that it's you can't even talk about this notion now, but there was a time in American history where the federal government actually paid down its debt. I mean, that's a laughable concept now. The ceiling is just going up forever in perpetuity. And we probably will ultimately completely erode not only the debt ceiling and not even be having these fights, but then the filibuster itself. And the only thing that could possibly prevent it would be that Republican senators actually pay a price for it. And I see no way in which anyone gets primaried over a vote like this. But until and unless voters feel that adamantly about these betrayals, one after the other from Republicans in the Senate, this is going to continue ad infinitum because there will be no cost borne by those who make these sorts of votes. So it's shameful. It's pathetic. I don't know how many other adjectives I could throw onto it. And, you know, the only other thing that I would say is you can understand why everything basically gets punted to the administrative state or the courts when this is what the world's greatest deliberative body is doing.
So
That's
Rachel,
so true.
So before we go to the next time, actually, I would actually love your thoughts on that, Rachel, because that's it. When I was playing devil's advocate on the Usually podcast when we did the filibuster, I was playing devil's advocate because I agree with you with the filibuster. But this is kind of the one point that I raised was like I was saying if I were playing devil's advocate here, I would say that the filibuster probably does result in the administrative state kind of arrogating even more responsibility to itself than it otherwise would have. So I'll just actually be genuinely curious for your thoughts.
Yeah,
there.
I would say it's not even the filibuster because it's not the filibuster here that's, you know, convoluting this process. It's the members. The members just don't want to vote. Republicans do not want to go on record voting for the debt ceiling that they all support increasing. And that's the problem, is that you have members who are contorting themselves and creating this complicated procedure so they can say, oh, it's not us, look, it's them, but they're setting up the process by which, you know, the debt ceiling will be raised. It's all about a lack of accountability. It's all about, you know, the hide the ball mentality that runs the United States Senate, which is that, oh, we can't vote for anything. We can't create a record because voting, again, I've said this before, but voting is the clearest, purest form of accountability that we have. And the more you layer it around these complex procedures, the more you rail against the filibuster, it just erodes the whole premise, which is, look, just vote. Right. And I have a piece in the Examiner today where I tried to make this point, like nobody has the guts anymore to just vote for what they support. So we create these like very convoluted arguments to twist ourselves into knots to try to hide how we actually stand for the voters. And I think that to the point that you just made about why people wanted Donald Trump, it was partly because of that, because they're sick and tired of, you know, this BS that comes out of Washington. So on that note, we're not quite done with the Senate yet. I think Emily is going to talk about Senator Rubio. Far more interesting than the debt ceiling.
Well, it is interesting, but in some ways not entirely different, and not entirely different from what Ben is going to talk about. Last week, we taped the podcast while I had just listened to former Vice President Mike Pence talk about the Dobbs case in front of pro-life activists. And today I just actually got back from Senator Rubio's Henry Clay lecture. I think it is the second inaugural Henry Clay lecture for American Compass, which was at Hillsdale's Kirby Center. And it was a very, very interesting speech. It sounded a lot of similar notes to what Senator Rubio has been talking about in recent years, which marks, of course, an evolution from sort of the Tea Party thinking that he started with. And actually, I interviewed Senator Ron Johnson today as well, right before we went and heard from Senator Rubio. And it was a similar thing. These are two people who came in on the Tea Party wave, who are now focused actually not on propping up business over government, but of thinking about how government can create a better, more nationalistic business climate in the country. And Senator Rubio had a lot of good quotes. I want to read them. My favorite was when he started talking a lot about what Ben is going to talk about how our executives are very, very interested in doing business with China, even when the equipment that they're making money off of could one day be used, as Senator Rubio said, to kill American soldiers. That puts it really starkly, but it is in fact true. This is a quote from the speech that he gave today. Lenin once predicted, the capitalists will sell us the rope with which we will hang them. For at least a decade now, everyday Americans have been telling us that trade-offs made 2 decades ago have not worked out well, that they accelerated the global rise of a communist regime at the expense of American jobs, industrial capacity, and national security. And one of my favorite quotes from the speech was, he said, in America that does not depend on any other nation for its prosperity, and in America with the industrial capacity to tackle any challenges that comes our way. And here's where this is different from Ben's subject in China. This is more broad than just China. This is about an executive class and an elite class that's primary allegiance is to the globe, as opposed to its primary allegiance being to the country. And Senator Rubio's call, we talk about these sorts of issues all of the time, and he sounded a lot of notes that we sound on this podcast all of the time. But his point was, he said at one point, imagine if we didn't have the capacity to manufacture vaccines in the United States of America. Imagine that. We would be relying on China's vaccine. We could be relying on anybody else's vaccines, but we still have that capacity here. We don't have that in every industry. We can't make all of the medicines we're incredibly reliant on without also being reliant on China. We just can't, because people in America wanted to make a lot of money off other countries, and that's left us less secure, and it has hollowed out the middle class. So we talk a lot about hollowing out the middle class. We talk less about how it also leaves us just less secure as a country. And Senator Rubio has been talking about this for a few years. You'll hear similar things at times from other members of the Senate and the House. I don't think anybody is spending as much time sort of focused on the intellectual conversation here as Senator Rubio is, but I want to throw it open to the group. I imagine we all broadly agree on the substance here, but I want to ask what the significance is, because we can talk about this until we're blue in the face and we can come to consensus sort of on the new right about it. But the question then becomes, Kellogg just said it's replacing its entire striking workforce with replacements, right? They're just all going to be gone. The right has to have an answer to some of these questions. Our old answer would have been very clear on that. I don't know what the new answer should be, but we need to actually start having concrete ideas. So with that, I'll send it open to everyone else.
So I'm happy to hop in here first. So I actually really wanted to attend the election this morning. I regret that I had to miss it. But I feel like in a way, Rubio under Mike Needham's stewardship is kind of channeling my NatCon speech from last month. My speech last month, I literally said, quote, between our sacrifice of the art of politics itself and our obsession with neoliberal orthodoxy, we have sowed the seeds of our own destruction. We have supplied the wokesters the very rope with which to hang ourselves. I didn't realize how I was like implicitly channeling Lenin or whoever it was that Mike Needham says I was channeling there, but it seems like that we're operating on similar wavelength here. So look, this is not the first time Rubio's gone there. Obviously, his NatCon speech touched on very similar themes. He kind of gave his kind of touchstone common good capitalism speech. I think it was at Catholic University towards the tail end of 2019, just before kind of COVID started. I mean, look, at the end of the day, guys, like, and I'm not talking to you three, but just to the audience, if you're listening or watching here, if you can kind of post-COVID, and I think at this point we're basically post-COVID, even though like our elites don't tell us that, right? If post-COVID, if you don't look at what happened as far as kind of the Chinese Communist Party's hoarding and personal protective equipment, and just the shocking kind of eye-opening awareness that America is dependent on many of our arch rivals for many of our most sensitive goods, whether it's PPE or whether it's really just some kind of semiconductors, sensitive technology, or anything like that. I mean, there is a problem here, okay? I mean, like, there obviously is a fundamental case to be made that in certain industries and certain goods in particular here, and Josh Hawley has a recent piece of legislation touching on this exact point, we should want to produce that at home. And, Michael Lind has written, a lot about local content requirements. LCR, I think, is kind of the linguistic shorthand term there. And we, in my opinion, should unapologetically and forthrightly put forth those kind of policies, especially obviously for various kind of sensitive supply lines here. But at the end of the day, look, I mean, I think the NatCon position on economics is more or less kind of like the Irving Kristol kind of two cheers for capitalism. We all are capitalists here. We all hate socialism. But at the end of the day here, this kind of gets back to the fundamental question, like, what is the telos? What is the purpose of all that we are doing? If we exist to serve the market, then that is one thing. I would argue that's not conservative. That is a dogmatic libertarianism. If we exist to serve kind of the traditional conservative ends of politics, justice, human flourishing, the common good, and so forth, the national interest, then the market is an incredibly useful tool to achieve those ends, but it is simply not sufficient in and of itself to do so.
Yeah, I think that's sort of getting at the guts of what this question is really about, because I think for 30 years, sort of the Republican political approach, and I think the conservative movement's been swept up in this, is that it's, economic growth, market growth, GDP, free trade. And a lot of that, was Reagan's legacy. I mean, he has other legacies, but it was what was necessary at the time he was president. I think we really did need a lot of that sort of, removal of top-down economic policies, more sort of economic flourishing needed to be a priority. But that's maintained almost as it's become the highest good in and of itself, separate and apart from how the country is doing, right? How families are being affected, how workers are being affected. And again, I think also our self-sufficiency has suffered to a dramatic degree. And I think that's been very evident through COVID. We can't make our own products anymore. God forbid we suffer another pandemic where all these countries shut down their borders. We're not trading. We're not, China's hoarding things that we need. We can't produce things. I mean, that's a problem. There's an interesting study that came out recently, I saw earlier today, that shows too that after NAFTA was passed, signed by Clinton, you saw a slow surge from Democratic counties into the Republican camp. And I think that just kind of goes to show, I think, the on the ground effect that some of these policy choices have made. And the last thing I'll say about it is that for the right, this is a sea change in thought, again, because I think we've been captured for so long by this sort of market ideal. But the right also has accepted these outcomes as inevitable, instead of looking at them as the result of policy choices that can be changed and undone. And I think that paradigm shift has to take place among our policymakers on a host of fronts, but especially here. These were policy choices, they can be changed.
Yeah, so let me just say, I mean, we've neither had truly free trade nor fair trade for a very long time. The sort of system that's been developed over the last 30 or 40 years is completely inconsistent, actually, with what the founders argued about the purpose of commerce and how commerce ought to be executed, as well as even what Adam Smith, by the way, talked about when he talked about free trade. And I'm actually working on a big project on this right now, and I'll divulge more of that probably in future episodes, and probably run through some of the quotes that show just how inconsistent our policy has been relative to what the founders foresaw, the most noted free marketeers foresaw. All I'd add, really, especially because I don't really want to totally jump the shark on what I'm going to talk about in a couple of segments, is the bottom line is we cannot be a free nation if we are not an independent nation. And independence involves being able to provide for ourselves, to fend for ourselves when it comes to every single strategically significant thing that's required to live life. That includes medicine, where obviously China dominates there, semiconductors, where Taiwan is the leading player. I mean, think about the danger of that. The fact that the semiconductor industry is pretty much completely dominated by a country 100 miles off the coast of China that's threatened with invasion by China. All manner of areas we can look to the fact that we are no longer an independent country, and thus really no longer a free country, because we don't have the domestic capacity to produce the components of our most imperative weaponry to keep our citizens healthy and safe, and in all manner of other areas as well. So globalization can be a great thing if you're dealing with other nations that are like-minded, and it's basically, we have capacity in one area, they have a stronger capacity in another area, and we trade the fruits of our labor, et cetera. But instead, what we have done is intentionally basically destroyed and hollowed out our industrial capacity to the direct benefit of our greatest adversary. And to play on that quote from Rubio, and I was going to do this in the final segment, but I'll just say it now. We're not just in a situation where the capitalists have sold the Chinese communists and many other people the rope with which to hang us. We're underwriting, advising, and serving as foreign agents for the hangmen themselves. That's where America is today.
All right. Well, with that, let's transition to our next topic here. So I'm going to start talking about blue city and blue state exodus. So the immediate occasion for this segment is a column that I have to say I saw coming for a while, which is Sohrab Ahmari's most recent column for the American Conservative, entitled "Goodbye Gotham," where he announces his intention to leave New York City, where he has largely led, with the exception of a short stint in London when he was working for the Wall Street Journal, since he graduated law school in 2012 or something along those lines. So long story short, you can read Sohrab's article at the American Conservative, but he basically advances a lot of very familiar arguments here, which is basically what the viewers and listeners, I think, largely intuit, especially in the aftermath, of course, of last summer's disastrous 1619 riots, which, of course, tore largely predominantly blue urban areas, tore them asunder all throughout the country. And Sohrab basically says, look, I mean, if in a lot of these cities, there's astronomically high crime. There are needles and drug users everywhere. The homeless situation is horrific. In New York City in particular, there are a lot of kind of unique problems to New York City. I was just in New York a few days ago. I'm currently recording this from DC, but I just came down from New York a few days ago. And, I was literally, I got drinks with my brother and my friend, and we were walking back to my brother's apartment. My brother lives on the Upper East Side. This is not exactly like a slum in like the middle of like Brooklyn or the Bronx. He lives in the Upper East Side. Literally like 2 blocks from his apartment. There's just trash everywhere on the streets. I don't remember. I kind of grew up in New York here. I don't remember when New York City got like this. Just like, I mean, Ben, you used to live there. I'll give you the first word to respond. I mean, I can't pinpoint when it's like trash, like little trash just started piling up in the street, and just the sheer number of like rats that you see like go. It's like it's barbaric. I mean, like this is literally like the first thing that came to my mind is like this is what President Trump meant when he famously referred to some countries as crap hole or whole countries, and like this is supposed to be the greatest city in the world here. So. I saw in Sohrab's particular case, I saw this coming. He had a very compelling, I thought, column that he wrote for the Post, the New York Post, that is, when he was op-ed editor there, and kind of the height of the 1619 riots. He had this terrible story about kind of being all up until the middle of the night, standing with his doorman in his building when people were vandalizing and looting. And then he had a similar column for City Journal, kind of just talking about how lost New York came in the midst of COVID. But I guess kind of the broader point here, and there's 2 broader points to make that I want to make. One is that we've kind of touched on in previous episodes here, which is as kind of the COVID Zoom work from home thing accelerates, and I personally see no reason to believe that's going to anything other than accelerate over the next 5, 10, 15, whatever years from now. The appeal of living in kind of these blue city meccas, New York, San Francisco, Chicago, DC, LA, whatever, is necessarily going to diminish, right? If you can do the same thing on like a massive plot of land with low taxes and a reasonable cost of living without kind of COVID hysteria and the mask mandate Karens and people like that, like why wouldn't you do so, right? So, I mean, one is I to be clear, there's a lot of, I think, negative repercussions of that as well, but certainly at least kind of like an empirical prediction, I would certainly predict that this accelerates. The other point, which is kind of something else that I've made in this podcast, is look, I mean, I have never actually lived in Manhattan, despite kind of growing up in the New York area, but I have lived in DC, Chicago. So I spent like my fair share of time in blue cities. I guess my kind of appeal or my message would be, it doesn't have to be this way. I moved to Miami a few months ago here, and it really is not that way in Miami. Crime is like not something that I basically ever think about. And I wasn't living in Miami during like the so-called cocaine cowboy cartel years, like the 1980s, when Scarface was being filmed and stuff. But nowadays, at least, crime is just like not something that any of my friends in Miami think about. I actually got lunch with the mayor of Miami, Francis Suarez, back in September. Not exactly a NatCon kind of Republican, as Dave Rubio would say. I'm not sure Francis knows what time it is, but he is a Republican, and he cares about he cares about the homelessness issue. He cares about diminishing crime. So there are like some big cities out there. I'm fortunate enough to live in one of them where like you have some mayors and some city councils that are actually focused on the bread and butter cultural civilizational issues here. But I kind of go back ultimately to, what our friend Matt Peterson likes to say. Matt likes to say, red states, new tech, new media. And, look, I mean, I again, like if you are a conservative and you're kind of living like behind enemy lines in like a deep blue state, if your job situation is such that like it affords you the opportunity, like, I would encourage you to really kind of do that, to take advantage of that, and to go with your feet to the extent possible here, because especially when it comes to like New York City and de Blasio with this private sector vax mandate now is kind of his latest kind of proverbial middle finger on his way out the door. Life does not have to be that way. I mean, life really can just be better. But I'll get off my soapbox on that. I want to give you the first opportunity to respond to that, though, Ben.
Yeah, so I've kind of watched the entire arc of New York from sort of the depths or just emerging from the depths of progressive dystopia to the pinnacle of, a thriving and dynamic city to now the decline again, being born in Manhattan in the 80s, raised in New Jersey, 45 minutes from lower Manhattan, going to school at Columbia from 06 on, and being in the city until really last summer when my family left and moved back to New Jersey, still behind enemy lines, so to speak, but in a bright red town, at least by New Jersey standards. So in any event, but we had planned to leave prior to the decline, which was obviously, it was readily notable. I wrote about it actually when Bill de Blasio was essentially unleashing terror on the streets of New York and telling cops to back off at the same time that you couldn't attend a religious service in Manhattan. It was very clear from the start that this was going to be exploited to maximally detrimental effect in New York City. And you can really trace the decline to the post-Bloomberg years. I mean, on almost every single policy, I disagreed with Michael Bloomberg, but the city was not declining, certainly at the rate to which it's declined under Bill de Blasio, essentially a Bolshevik mayor. And yes, the response to de Blasio of a future Mayor Adams, may reflect kind of, people being unable to tolerate the decline in the standard of living in the basic everyday life in New York. But I'm not at all confident that that the trend lines are going to truly reverse under an Adams. And I think what are the high level takeaways of this? One is that bad ideas can generate terrible consequences very quickly. And you can go from a couple of decades of prosperity and rebirth and a boom of a city culturally, economically, and beyond to utter destruction very quickly, simply as a consequence of obvious decisions. If you're going to back off, no cash bail, obviously, if you're going to tell cops to back off, if you're going to have an anti-capitalist sort of mentality, and on, this is the consequence of it. But I think the most disturbing thing, and I do think this is something nationwide in a lot of blue locales, is that there's really no pushback within the city. I mean, yes, again, Eric Adams may have been elected, may have emerged from the field, but still, he's going to be operating in hoc to the most radical of radical progressives. I mean, AOC is on steroids in Manhattan. And I think as a consequence of all this, not just middle class, but upper middle class and beyond people will be forced out of cities just like New York. And it will be truly the dystopia of a San Francisco, of the highest of the high and the lowest of the low sort of coalition, where those who can afford to pay to avoid dealing with the consequences of the policies will do so. And those at the bottom rung of the ladder will be mired, stuck there. And that's devastating for the country. And I think you see it to a lesser degree across really blue locales everywhere. The leftist policies obviously create crime, deter economic formation, family creation, and all the other things necessary to living a vibrant, fulfilling, meaningful life. And I pray to God that more than 50% of the country wakes up and realizes this disaster. It's a layup, by the way, for Republicans who actually care about their constituents, if only they'll actually put out a positive agenda to meet the problems.
My quick thought is, as somebody who didn't grow up in or really near a major city, I don't think I went to New York. I remember I spent a couple of hours in New York once when I was like 14, but not until college after that. But what New York means to the country is more than what New York means to New York. And that is, I feel like, hard for people maybe on the East Coast to understand, people who grew up going to New York, but it's what our big cities mean about our country. They're supposed to be these monuments to American greatness, to commerce, to community, and they have been. We've always seen them that way. And New York is such a sad example because it's the cultural capital of the universe, literally the cultural capital of the universe. And to see it in disrepair and basically falling into a state where it is Gotham. Michael Schellenberger's statistics on San Francisco crime and the correlation between the changing of laws and the deliberate decisions not to enforce certain laws. It is stunning. It is a willful killing of these cities. The evidence is now abundantly clear, and these testaments to American greatness and America. I mean, we've never seen anything like New York City. We've never seen anything like American cities, especially when they sprung up throughout the course of our history. They're incredibly important to our history. They're important to our identity, and to see them falling in disrepair is sort of symbolically very important, but also practically very important for our sort of self-imagination as a country.
Yeah, the only thing I have to add is this like theme of things like our policy consequences. And it's kind of amazing to watch Democrats run away from the very obvious consequences of the policies they've made. You saw Jen Psaki stand at the White House podium and be asked about like the looters, like going into, Gucci and all these like high-end stores in California and looting them. And, the reporter's like, why do you think this is happening? And she's like, oh, definitely because of the pandemic. And it's like, no, nobody's stealing bread because they're hungry. No, they're stealing like luxury purses. And the reason this is happening is because, the police have been told to stand down, no cash bail has let criminals back on the streets. And, again, law enforcement doesn't matter in a lot of these cities. So we're seeing a very clear, like, cause and effect. And if smart people that rule us would actually put those things together, maybe we could actually have some constructive dialogue, but we live in upside down, stupid world. So that never happens. Anyway, on that note, who's next?
So I guess I'll jump in to talk a little bit about our China kowtowing ruling class and the tip of the spear, maybe the most non-ideological part of the ruling class, incidentally, and to China's benefit, but the tip of that spear being the financial services sector, which I guess is incorrectly called Wall Street, when in reality, almost all the banks are in Midtown, and they'll probably all leave Midtown for Miami soon as a consequence of everything we've talked about so far in this episode. But really, I want to just focus on two kind of split screen image that has sort of come up over the last couple of weeks, which was the CEO of JP Morgan, Jamie Dimon, made a quick comment during, I believe, remarks at, I think, Boston College or Boston University, where he talked about the fact that the Chinese Communist Party is celebrating its 100th year, and in 100 years, JP Morgan will still be standing and the party won't. Something to that effect. He said that in a speech, was immediately, I'm sure, savaged by Chinese Communist Party authorities, and within days thereafter recanted those remarks, said he didn't mean to offend anyone. A spokesperson said, he doesn't want to speak badly about any other foreign country or group of people, et cetera. It was clear he got the message very quickly. I wish he had stood up for those remarks, actually. That might have been a seminal moment, a massive sea change, could have effectuated a massive sea change among our financial services sector. But of course, the problem was that JPM itself has substantial operations in China, was recently granted the rights to engage in more banking opportunities on the mainland than ever before. And so consequently, he would say this was a business decision, essentially. Also recently, Ray Dalio, the CEO of Bridgewater, which is the largest hedge fund in the world in terms of assets under management, so a major player in the financial services sector, came out and made some comments for which he received a massive amount of outrage during a program on CNBC. And basically, the question was posed to him by the co-anchor of the show. Now, how do you think about investing in China, given all the myriad human rights violations that have occurred there? And I thought his response to this was very telling. In so many ways, this episode is just the perfect illustration of how corrupted our ruling class in general and our financial services sector is in particular when it comes to China. He said, quote, "I can't be an expert in those types of things. I really have no idea." And he said that he deferred to whatever the rules are based on the guidance of the government as the most important thing governing his investments abroad. But then he went even further. And by the way, let me just note, this plea of ignorance here about, I don't really know anything about it, can't be an expert in those types of things. We're talking about one of the most sophisticated investors in the world, running the largest hedge fund in the world, which is maybe the largest private fund manager in mainland China. Dalio himself has touted the fact that he's been traveling to China since 1984, and he was there from the start of the growth of capital markets on the mainland in China. And he even sent his 11-year-old child to live there, then 11-year-old child to live there for a certain amount of time. So it absolutely strains credulity that a person like this would not be aware of what goes on under the Chinese Communist Party. He goes on to then draw moral equivalence with the United States. He says, and then I look at the United States and I say, well, what's going on in the United States? What's going on in the United States? And should I not invest in the US because other things, our own human rights issues? I'm not trying to make political comparisons. I'm basically just trying to follow the rules and invest properly. That was his quote. And the last thing he added, which is what really got him under hot water, is that, basically the co-host said, there's clear difference between America and China. China disappears people. And how did Dalio respond to that? Look, you want to get into the policy of disappearing people? I'll give a little bit of perspective on that. What they have is an autocratic system. And then Dalio goes on to contrast what Chinese leaders have said about China's system versus America's. And so he quotes this unnamed leader. The United States is a country of individuals and individualism. In China, it's an extension of the family. As a top-down country, it's like a strict parent. They behave like a strict parent. That's their approach. We have our approach. If I evaluated all approaches around the world in all countries, I'd be in a bind to try to find out, where do I invest? This actually directly contradicts something that Dalio did say a couple years prior. And I've tweeted this out, and I'm going to include this in an article, a forthcoming article. He said something very similar, but he did weigh in. Whether you prefer a more autocratic leadership system than a democratic leadership system, you'll have to make that choice for yourself. Speaking of the US and China, don't look at it as some unique place, China, in terms of some of those impediments. Look at the whole picture. I would say that the Chinese or Confucian way of approaching things has a lot to be said for it. So he did weigh in back in 2019 about his view as to the Chinese system, and he clearly sees some things that he admires in it. Now, he later walked back these arguments. He said, I'm not trying to draw moral equivalence, essentially, between the two sides, et cetera. There's clearly nothing equal in terms of the nature of our systems, and I'm an American, effectively. But he also said that basically we should continue our engagement with China. It's essential to peace, that it produces peace and mutual understanding between the two sides. He didn't recant. He didn't say, I'm going to divest from communist China or anything of close to that. In fact, he said earlier this year, as China was engaging in its massive regulatory crackdown, so-called, you need to understand China is a state capitalist system, which means the state runs capitalism to serve the interests of most people. Is this a Chinese Communist Party apparatchik speaking or a US investor? And the policymakers won't let the sensitivities of those in the capital markets and rich capitalists stand in the way of doing what they believe is best for the most people of the country. And you can go back and you can look at his record over a number of years. And he basically always takes this position of, well, look, we need to diversify our investments. China is a massive growing market. They're trending up. We're trending like this. And so it just pays as a natural hedge. You got to invest in China. But I think what this shows much more broadly is that Dalio is the archetype of the person in financial services who, and not just finance, by the way, but Dianne Feinstein or people in Hollywood or anywhere else. These relationships with China are cultivated going back decades. China weds itself to us with the promise of economic prosperity or any number of other inducements. And then ultimately it corrupts our side to the point where we serve as mouthpieces for our foreign adversary. And as I said before, we underwrite our adversary, we advise our foreign adversary, and then of course we serve as unregistered foreign agents for our worst adversary. And the point I'll leave with is we will never be able to confront communist China if our purported leaders don't view it as an imperative to confront communist China. And worse than that, they're talking about actively aiding, abetting, and enabling communist China. And forget about the human rights aspect of this for a second. They don't even deal with the issue of what about the national interest? What about the fact that this country wants us buried? They want to be the dominant player, and that will completely destroy whatever fruits of capitalism the likes of hedge fund managers and others have enjoyed. So with that, the thing that I would open up is what can be done to change the paradigm and essentially force those at the commanding heights of society to change when it comes to communist China? What would be the Overton window shifting way to fundamentally change the calculus on the ground? And with that, I'd kind of turn it over to the group.
So I don't have a good answer to this question. I'm not sure that there is a good answer to this question, and I'll have to go super quick. By the way, just on a purely personal note, I actually interviewed with Ray Dalio's hedge fund out of college. I ended up going down a different career path, obviously, but that was a wild freaking interview. Bridgewater Associates is an interesting place. I would encourage the listeners and viewers to kind of Google it and poke around and form your own conclusions here. First of all, to Ben's kind of point about Dalio in particular, we are talking here about one of the world's most successful and clearly sophisticated, well-read and all that investors. So for him to kind of plead ignorance, let alone play the moral relativism card that we hear from like the AOCs and Rashida Tlaibs of the world, I mean, this is just, I mean, it's anti-American. I mean, fundamentally, obviously. I mean, when Marco Rubio is talking about like a pro-American capitalism, a common good capitalism that works for the United States of America, that really is the complete antithesis of everything that we just heard from Ray Dalio here. So those two segments, I think, clearly correlate to one another. But kind of just the other point that I make, I got coffee in DC this morning with a friend, and we were talking a little bit about this, about just the imperative to economically disentangle from China here. The point is that these funds, the 4,500, the various investment outfits, they're just never going to do it, literally not going to do it on their own. And it's extraordinarily intuitive and easy to understand why that is the case, because when your goal is for ROI for investors, P&L statements and things of that nature, you have no incentive to do so, obviously. And that makes total sense in the world. So the upshot is that there has to be state action. There has to be kind of direct political action taken, like ideally, obviously, legislative action. But, if there's some wiggle room for maneuverability for some sort of kind of executive order, I think we probably should be open to that as well here. But something from the state has to happen to force these private sector actors' hands, because they simply, by sheer dint of their incentive structure, will not do so on their own, obviously.
And Tim Cook, by the way, this week, I mean, it also reminds me of Bob Iger, where Bob Iger a couple of years ago was asked about Hong Kong, and he said the exact same thing. This is not Disney's business. Of course, they were happy to say proudly they were pulling out of Georgia because of potential abortion legislation. But when it came to China, it was not Disney's place to comment on that. And bear in mind that the people they work with in China are actively muddying the waters, right? And raising questions about the severity of the human rights allegations. And they're the ones that are saying the United States has its own comparable human rights violations. They're the ones that are putting this is a propaganda campaign. And that's why you hear the people echoing all of these talking points. And when you have Tim Cook signing what's estimated to be a $275 billion deal to help invest in China, in the Chinese economy, part of it in renewable energy, that is helping people that are explicitly against the company that afforded you the freedoms to invent your products and sell your products and change the world. I mean, they are fundamentally aligned against us. And so to help them is anti-American. But if you have this idea that helping them helps people struggling in China because your allegiance is to the globe and not to the United States of America, that's how you rationalize these things.
Yeah, I don't really have anything else to add. I think this is, one of the sort of paramount problems facing us, and it's the consequence of a highly globalized economy, is that you have companies who just don't see themselves, they take advantage of the American system, they employ Americans, but at the end of the day, they see themselves as citizens of the world. And I don't think that we as a country, as sort of, even as just from an economic policy standpoint, as a sovereignty standpoint, have really grappled with that fact. And this is a policy question. So I do think that this represents one of the greatest challenges we have, not just as a movement on the right, but just sort of for our public policy moving forward. So I think we can take it to final thoughts from here. I guess I'll start with just this theme that I keep coming back to and thinking about more broadly as I think about where the right should go. And I think it frames so much of what we talked about today, which is this idea that both our political parties will not take agency for anything that's happening. They rest in this theory of just inevitability, like, oh, it's everything just is happening. And there was nothing that we could have done to prevent this or stop it. You see this with the left's approach, right? We talked about the cities like burning down and they're like, oh, it's just the pandemic. We couldn't have any control over this. And it's like, no, guys, it's because you did a thing, right? You did something and now you're seeing the effect of it. There's a cause and an effect. That this is not inevitable. You can make policy that changes this. And on the right, I think you see it very often in response to the consequences of globalization, or, I talk about big tech a lot. I think you see a lot in the big tech debate, which is, oh, we couldn't help that these companies are what they are. This is just the fruits of innovation. Aren't you glad about it? And it's like, no, at some point there is an agency there. We cultivate innovation and tradition, and innovation and build it into our values and traditions, instead of just simply saying whatever happens is best, whatever the market produces is the best thing for us. And so I do think that shrouds this false, misplaced feeling of inevitability shrouds a lot of our politics, when what we need is agency, an agency to say, yes, we're responsible, or yes, we will change and actively do this. And that's what I think is missing in a lot of these conversations.
So I'll hop in. So on the segment that we just had, I referred to this coffee that I had with a friend in DC this morning, and he actually raised something from our previous podcast. His friend's apparently a devout listener of the NatCon squad, so kudos to this friend. And he had some feedback for my segment the last time about judicial nominations after Dobbs that I thought was actually really incisive. I think it's kind of worth just kind of fleshing that out a little bit more here. So if you go back to the last episode, I was talking a little bit about if Dobbs, that's the abortion case out of Mississippi, of course, if this case goes the wrong way and Roe versus Wade is not overturned, what judicial nominations can look like. And one of the things that conservatives have talked a lot about for the past 10, 15 years, probably not often enough, is trying to vet for nominees who can withstand the so-called greenhouse effect. The greenhouse effect was this it's an obvious play on words. It refers to the longtime New York Times SCOTUS columnist Linda Greenhouse. The idea is that kind of Republican nominees, they get to DC, they attend the Georgetown cocktail parties, all that stuff, and they inevitably drift to the left. And there are obviously infinite examples for this: Harry Blackmun, John Paul Stevens, Anthony Kennedy, Sandra Day O'Connor, David Souter, John Roberts. I mean, there's many examples. But the point that my friend made, I think it's a good one, was he was kind of arguing that when I phrased it the way that I just phrased it there, that we should vet for people who can withstand that, it's kind of getting the causal link actually backwards. And instead of looking for people who kind of have the spine to resist the inevitable effect, what we should be focusing on is just looking at contemporarily kind of who the social milieu of like the nominees are, who they are socializing with, because that in effect then will dictate what their incentive structures are as far as kind of, who they want to be liked by, right? So the whole point of the greenhouse effect is looking at someone like Anthony Kennedy, who clearly wants or wanted the New York Times approval, he inevitably will kind of drift left on abortion, marriage, all the cultural issues and whatnot. But if you look at like where the nominees themselves are like literally socializing in the present, it can possibly be quite indicative. And to kind of just flesh this out and give one very concrete example here, and then I'll kind of get off my soapbox on judicial noms hopefully for a little while now. Neil Gorsuch, who I like to pick on, I think more than most conservatives often do, he grew up Catholic, but by the time that he was nominated to the U.S. Supreme Court, he attended not just a Protestant church, but a pretty theologically liberal Protestant church that, if I'm not mistaken, I've heard this from many people, proudly flies rainbow flags outside of it. So, I'll let the viewer and listener kind of fill in the dots from there and conclude their own thoughts. But, my friend and I at Coffee, I think we're on the same page here, that data point in and of itself probably should have been enough to seriously harm and possibly sink that nomination on itself.
Well, if Dianne Feinstein is going to treat Catholics the way that she does, you can see how, like, even traditionalists on the right don't treat their nominees that way, don't use those sorts of religious litmus tests. But Dianne Feinstein, she's happy to do it. I think Josh is right. I'm not saying that it should be hammered in a Senate hearing, but it's a little bit of a red flag, of course. So my final thought is, thinking about that Kellogg's example that I brought up and sort of glossed over earlier. They said they were working 80-hour work weeks during the pandemic and only got a 3% raise, and they have all of these concerns as a big company. And my response is just the right needs to have an answer to it. And that's not a particularly helpful response or original response. I'm not a policy person. I will leave solving the world's problems to Rachel, and I will leave that weight on her shoulders because I don't know. I mean, she has to. But the question is, what can the right do with consensus? I do think it's true, just based on conversations with Senator Johnson and Senator Rubio's speech this morning. I think it's possible there's consensus mounting on the right about our general approach to corporate America, but the right needs to have an answer to workers and to labor, and it can't just be we are paying attention to them and we care about them. And I think way too often that's what it is. And this is a very hypocritical point to make, because that's sort of what I'm doing with this point. But my broader point is that I want to have an answer. I want to be able to say, this is concretely what the stance should be in Bessemer, in Kellogg, and down the line. I want to have that policy. I think it's being developed, but just my central argument here is we cannot rest on just virtue signaling that we care about these folks and that we care about labor. We have to push further than that.
And I think, one of the perverse kind of positives of China's rise is that it creates a national imperative to focus on American workers in American industry. And even if that means it's non-economic at first glance in the way of the cheapest product, as quick as possible, because it's a national imperative in terms of the survival of our country. And ultimately, our long-term prosperity is predicated on us being independent and having thriving communities, families, and beyond. I'll just go back to the last segment really quick to just say, I think the goal first of all, a critical policy, simple one, is do no harm when it comes to national security and foreign policy. And so what would that imply with respect to communist China? We should do everything we can to not invest there, operate there, or advocate on behalf of it. And the advocating part of it, of course, there is FARA, Foreign Agent Registration Act, which we know can be abused and turned on political enemies. So it's scary. And there's also First Amendment issues surrounding it. But that said, if we're looking at Overton windows with respect to China, I think it would be delisting of all Chinese-based companies, period, full stop. No lobbying for any Chinese corporations from Huawei on down. And then beyond, even broader ways of challenging any companies that do, in fact, sort of try to flout these areas in terms of sanctions or beyond. I think individual major examples of cracking down on business with China could effectuate a massive sea change. Now, China itself is preparing for a time where we are decoupled. They're probably more serious about decoupling than we are, and they intend to be able to operate fully independently at that point. But I think that's where we need to get to, of what's one pole of what this relationship would look like, and then work towards it. And I think that could help effectuate a massive sea change with respect to China, and then also serve America's national interests as well.
I think on that note, we've wrapped it up for today. So on behalf of Josh, Ben, and Emily, thanks for tuning in, and we will see you on the next NatCon Squad.